Run your fingers up the hard little bumps at the back of your neck. And the number 33 starts telling a different story than the one you were handed. John chapter 19 does not pull your eyes towards scenery first. It pulls them to a name. Golgotha, the place of the skull. That should bother you more than it does. Why preserve that word so carefully if the setting is all that matters? Why not say a roadside, a gate, a ridge, a field? But John keeps the skull in the frame. Then Latin tradition gives you Calvaria, and that word does something strange. It does not stay in theology. It crosses into anatomy. Calvaria is also the skull cap, the upper part of the cranium. So now the site of the crucifixion and a real structure of the human head are sharing one name. And most people never stop long enough to ask why. You can feel the problem already. Once the text points to the skull, the body enters the room. And when the body enters the room, the old picture starts to wobble. Because the route to the head is not random. In development, the human spine is counted in 33 vertebrae. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 4 coccygeal. A full vertical path from the base upward. So let me ask you the question the usual sermons never ask. If Golgotha is named with that much precision, and if the body itself carries a 33-step column ending at the head, are you still sure this is only geography? Or have you been staring at a map without recognizing it? And the next clue is even harder to wave away, because ancient medicine itself marked the very bottom of that path as holy. If this line of thought grabs you, stay with me and give the video a like before we go deeper. That lower end matters more than people realize, because the body does something very old with names. Greek and Roman physicians looked at the broad wedge of bone seated between the hips and gave it a title that should stop you cold. Os sacrum, the sacred bone. In Greek, hieron osteon, the holy bone. Dry bone on a table, hard to the touch, pale under lamplight, and still they marked that place with sacred language. Why there? Why the base? Why would medical tradition, of all things, preserve holiness at the bottom of the same column that climbs toward the skull? People act as if religion and anatomy live in separate rooms, but here they are touching elbows. The word sacred is built right into the structure, and once you notice that, the path from the base to the head stops looking accidental. You have a named summit, a counted ascent, and a holy foundation. That is already too much pattern to ignore. Then, scripture starts sounding different in your ears. Psalm 24 asks, "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord?" And most listeners picture terrain. But if the body itself contains an ascent, if the lowest support is already called holy, then ascending may be carrying more than one layer at once. The old texts do this all the time. They speak in surfaces while hiding a second set of coordinates underneath. You can hear it if you stop rushing. And here is where the case tightens. A path is one thing. A named base is another. But a sacred root means very little unless something actually moves through it. Something does. Constantly. Quietly. Right now, while you sit there listening, inside that same vertical channel, a clear fluid is traveling the entire way. And when you hear how often it cycles, John's strange detail at the crucifixion scene starts to sound far less random. That movement is the piece most people never bring into the reading, and once you do, the whole scene starts to tighten. Inside the same column we've been tracing, cerebrospinal fluid rises and falls in a constant wash. Clear, slick, almost glass-like in description. It cushions, feeds, and circulates through the cord all day long. Your body makes about 500 milliliters of it in a day, then renews that supply again and again. So the route to the skull is not some dead ladder in a textbook. It is active right now. Sit with that for a second. A named summit in John, a holy base in old anatomy, a living current moving through the middle. How many clues do you need before Golgotha stops sounding like a mere location marker? If the text points to the head and the body keeps a fluid path toward the head, why would the crucifixion account preserve a fluid detail that most readers rush right past? Because John does preserve it. Chapter 19, verse 34. A spear is put into the side, and the writer stops long enough to note what came out: blood and water. He does not linger over the dust on the road. He does not pause over the smell of wood or sweat or iron in the air. He marks the fluids. That is deliberate. In a story packed with symbolic choices, this one gets named. And now you have to decide whether that line is decoration or signal. Blood, sure, everybody expects that. But water? Why water there? Why say it that way? Why preserve the pairing? Once you know that a ruptured canal can release blood with cerebrospinal fluid, the verse starts sounding less like stray observation and more like a key slid under a locked door. Which means the next question is dangerous. If the writer encoded a mechanism inside the death scene, then what else in the story has been treated as biography when it may have been anatomy all along? That is where the number starts becoming a problem for the standard story. People speak about 33 as if the text carved it in stone, as if one of the gospel writers paused, dipped the pen, and said it plainly. But when you go looking for that line, you run into silence. Luke chapter 3 verse 23 says Jesus was about 30 when he began. About. That is the word you get. So where did the clean, polished certainty come from? From later counting, later stitching, later confidence. A little arithmetic here, an assumption there, and soon the number walks around wearing the costume of Scripture. But Scripture is thinner than that. The body, meanwhile, is not thin on this point at all. The ascent we've been tracing carries the number openly. It does not need guesswork. It does not need anyone to round upward and call the result sacred. And that should press on you. Why has tradition clung so fiercely to 33 if the written line is softer than people admit? Why did that number survive in memory with such force? Why does it keep surfacing around the very root that ends at the head? Once the blood and water clue is on the table, once the sacred base and the upward path are already in view, the old explanation starts sounding borrowed, almost like a cover sheet laid over something older and more physical. Then another possibility opens. What if the famous number was preserved because it belonged to a pattern people could sense long before they could explain it? What if biography inherited a code it did not fully understand? That would mean Golgotha, the place of the skull, is sitting inside a much larger field of symbols, one that did not begin in a single sermon or a single tradition. Because here is the part most people never dare test. When you step outside the gospel for a moment, you find other ancient systems staring at the same vertical mystery from completely different doors. And once you look through those other doors, the same shape keeps showing up with an almost annoying persistence. A force hidden low, an ascent through the center, a crown above. Different languages, different rites, different images carved in stone or whispered in instruction, but the geometry keeps repeating. You are still inside the same mystery, still inside the same vertical root that ends at the head. In older Indian teaching, the rise is described as a power sleeping at the base and moving upward through the central channel. In Egyptian symbolism, the spine is not background furniture. It becomes a sacred pillar, raised upright in ritual form. You do not need all of those systems to agree on theology for the pattern to matter. They do not have to shake hands across history. They only have to keep pointing from the lower foundation toward the summit. And that is exactly what they do. So ask yourself the uncomfortable question. If John names the place of the skull, if anatomy gives you the counted ascent, if old physicians mark the base as holy, and if other traditions preserve the same upward drama, how long can this still be dismissed as coincidence? How many times does a map have to be redrawn before you admit there may be one terrain underneath it? This is where many people get nervous and back away, because the subject stops being a Bible argument and starts becoming personal. If the route is in you, then the text is not only asking to be believed, it is asking to be recognized. That changes the temperature completely. And there is one more reason the skull keeps returning in all of this, not as a poetic flourish, as a destination with something specific inside it. A small structure, hidden deep and dark, sitting near the center of the head, long associated with light, cycles, and inner timing. Once that comes into view, Golgotha stops sounding like a dramatic name and starts sounding like an anatomical target. That hidden structure is where the argument turns from broad pattern to precise target. Deep inside, tucked between the hemispheres, sits the pineal gland. Small, pale, almost seed-like in shape, buried in darkness, it has carried an outsized reputation for centuries. People have surrounded it with myth, sure, but strip the exaggeration away and one fact still remains. This is a single structure, centered inside the skull, tied to cycles of light and dark. Now listen to Matthew chapter 6, verse 22 with that in mind. If thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. A single eye. Not your paired eyes, wet at the corners, blinking at the world. A single one. Why speak that way at all? Why choose that image unless sacred language is pointing inward as well as outward? Once the summit of the root is in view, the phrase stops sounding decorative. It starts sounding directional. And the direction matters because this whole case has been narrowing. The counted ascent, the holy base, the moving fluid, the named skull. None of that lands by accident if the top contains a singular organ long linked with hidden light. You do not have to force every line of scripture into anatomy to see the overlap. You just have to stop pretending the overlap is weak. It is not weak. It is sitting there in plain text and plain flesh. Then another old line starts to hum. John chapter 3, verse 8. The wind bloweth where it listeth. Thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh. Breath, spirit, movement, inner current. The Bible keeps circling unseen action. It keeps speaking as if the most important processes are the ones you cannot hold in your hand. So when the crucifixion reaches the skull, and when the text later speaks of completion, you are no longer looking at a random endpoint. You are standing at the exact place where inward ascent, hidden light, and final announcement collide. And that final announcement is the next lock that has to open. That announcement in John is easy to hear as the end of a life and much harder to hear as the completion of a pattern. Chapter 19, verse 30 says, "It is finished." Most people hear closure. Fair enough. But closure of what? If the same chapter has already named the skull and preserved the blood and water detail, why assume the sentence only points in one direction? Why force it to stay flat? By this point, the scene has gathered too many markers. The route below, the sacred base, the fluid in motion, the singular center in the head, and now the words of completion spoken at the very summit, named by the text itself. If you were building a symbolic anatomy into a sacred narrative, what would you do differently? You would mark the destination. You would mark the release. You would mark the completion. John marks all three. This is where people usually get defensive, because they think an inner reading threatens the outer one. It does not have to. Ancient stories often carry layers, the way stone carries heat after sunset. One level can remain, while another begins to glow through it. The problem is not that the text is too rich. The problem is that generations were trained to read only one surface and call the rest imagination. Then think about where the sentence happens. At the skull, at the named head, at the terminus of the very ascent the body already knows. If the writer wanted to leave behind more than memory, if he wanted the scene to operate as a sign inside the listener as well, this is exactly where the signal would be planted. And once you allow that possibility, another set of instructions hidden in the teaching starts sounding far less vague. The private room, the closed door, the unseen father. People hear devotional advice there. Maybe. But what if those lines were also pointing toward conditions inside the body that change what happens in the skull when the world goes dark? That is where the teaching gets uncomfortably practical. Matthew chapter 6 verse 6 says, "When thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret." Most people hear private devotion, and yes, that reading is there. But why the shut door? Why the hidden place? Why the emphasis on what is unseen? Once the skull has become part of the map, those details start sounding physical as well as spiritual. Because the structure we've been circling is tied to darkness, light strikes your eyes, the body shifts, darkness settles in, another process begins. You have felt this your whole life without naming it. Evening comes, the room cools a little, the glow from a screen fades, your eyelids grow heavy, your thoughts loosen. The body responds to hidden conditions. It always has. So when the text pushes you towards secrecy, inwardness, and withdrawal from outer light, that is not empty poetry. It is a setting. Then go back to the place itself, Golgotha, the place of the skull. If that name is part of the code, then "go into your room" begins to sound like an instruction for an interior chamber. Shut the door to the outer senses, reduce the noise, reduce the glare. Let the head become the site where the next stage can happen. Suddenly, prayer is no longer only speech aimed upward. It becomes attention gathered inward. And this is exactly why the old language of ascent never disappears. The route through the body is not enough by itself. The summit has to be approached under the right conditions. A temple with every gate open to sunlight is one thing. A chamber sealed for encounter is another. Scripture keeps returning to the second image for a reason. So now the case is moved from names and numbers into method. And once there is a method, the final question stops being, is this symbolic? The final question becomes much more dangerous. What happens if you actually test it, the same day you hear it? That test is where argument gives way to exposure. Because once a claim touches the body, you can stop pretending it is only theory. Think about everything the scene has already gathered around itself. A skull named on purpose, a counted ascent remembered more clearly than the text supports in biography, a holy base, a living fluid, a hidden center in the head, a saying about secret prayer under shut conditions. At some point, the pile of clues stops feeling accidental and starts feeling instructional. And that is why this reading unsettles people. It does not leave the crucifixion safely framed in stained glass or faraway dust. It drags the whole matter into your own nervous system. If the gospel preserved more than memory, then the meaning of the place reaches into the body hearing the story. That is much more demanding than agreeing with a doctrine. Agreement can stay in the mouth. Recognition has to happen deeper. Take John chapter 7, verse 38. Out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. Again, the language is internal, flowing from within, moving in the body. You can keep reducing that to metaphor if you want, but by now, the pattern has become almost stubborn. Scripture keeps talking as if the human interior is a sanctuary with currents, chambers, ascent, and light. And Golgotha, the place of the skull, sits at the top of that entire arrangement like a final marker. So the last barrier is not evidence, the last barrier is nerve. Are you willing to treat the text as something that points back at you? Are you willing to sit still long enough to find out whether the secret place is only a phrase or whether it names a condition you can actually enter? Because if the teaching does carry an activation inside it, then the final step is embarrassingly simple. A dark room, a closed door, a few quiet minutes. No audience, no performance. Just you, your breath, and the same skull the text has been naming all along. Which means the next move cannot stay theoretical any longer. So here is the only honest ending this kind of reading allows. You do not settle it by arguing one more round. You settle it by entering the conditions the text keeps circling. A room with the light off. A door shut. The jaw unclenched. The spine easy, not rigid. A few slow breaths. Attention gathered behind the forehead, where thought usually scatters and runs. Then you wait, without forcing anything. That is not theater. It fits the trail we followed. John 19 gives the skull its name. The old body count gives the ascent its measure. The holy base gives the route its first marker. The fluid gives it motion. The hidden center in the head gives it a destination. And the private chamber sayings give it a setting. By the time you arrive there, the story is no longer asking for applause. It is asking for stillness. Maybe nothing dramatic happens the first time. Maybe you only notice the hum in your ears, the weight of your own face, the strange brightness that appears even with your eyes closed. Maybe you become aware of how loud the body is when the room goes quiet. That is enough. A lock does not announce itself with a trumpet when it starts to turn. It gives way by a fraction. And that may be the hardest truth in all of this. The great veil people chase in public often thins in a small, dark room with no witness but breath. A name in scripture, a line of bone, a current you never felt because you were too busy looking outward. They can meet there without spectacle. After a while, the air in the room feels cooler on the skin. The house settles. Somewhere beyond the wall, a pipe clicks once and goes still. And the word skull no longer sounds like a distant place name. It sounds like a door left slightly open in your own house.